And welcome to the Fat Middle-Aged Man with MS, a thought-provoking blog. Now, get stuck in, will you?
Hi there, it's the Fat Middle-Aged Man with MS here. I want to address particularly those that have been newly diagnosed with multiple sclerosis or suspected multiple sclerosis. But actually, it probably applies to just about everybody. We have had a lot of information in the past by the medical profession saying that one of the likely or possible causes of multiple sclerosis is bacterial or viral, initial bacterial or viral infection. And I was diagnosed when I was 27, and I was, like most people, studying what I can do to help myself deal with the multiple sclerosis, either physically or mentally, particularly, as I discussed in my first video, which I guess rambled a little bit too much, but I want to try and get to the point here. Firstly, when I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, I had very, very, very bad heads, and I went to the doctor and then my specialist, and they would say, "Well, look, it's not something that we're aware of that multiple sclerosis will cause." But the heads were so severe that sometimes in fact, soon after I was diagnosed, I was a financial advisor at the time, and I was going to people's houses, and I was having to lie down on their couch to ease the pressure in my head. And when I would sneeze, it was like my head wanted to explode. It's like the blood vessels in my head wanted to burst out of my skull, and it was so painful. And often I would be asleep, and I'd have a bad head, so I'd have to sit up. And also many other things happened. I would be driving in the car, and I'd have this certain feeling in my head that I was almost going to pass out. So I used to have to stop the car, get out, and sort of move around a bit, almost like getting the blood flow. But I had no idea what it was. It was just something that I'd got used to for probably at least 15 years. I've had MS now for 31 years, so it was for at least 15 years I had these experiences. A couple of occasions I was a passenger in a car, and I got out of the car and I just passed out. Totally bizarre, and I was screened for epilepsy and anything like that, and it was they came back negative, which obviously was great. But the reason why I think it's so important, if you haven't already had blood tests for specific types of infection, after my research about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, you'll have to forgive me if my time is slightly out, but maybe between 3 and 4 years ago, I was researching. I didn't understand why I was the only member of my family that had multiple sclerosis. There was nothing in my grandparents or aunties and uncles or anything like that, my brothers, so I asked my mother, what illnesses did I have as a child? And I had the usual, except I had scarlet fever as well, but then that wasn't relevant. But what I started doing was actually trying to look at what other infections would cause very, very bad heads. And after a lot of research, I got down to about 4 or 5 potential infections. And to cut a long story short, I actually went and had some private blood tests. And what amazed me was that the blood test said that at some point I'd had meningitis and tick-borne encephalitis. And if you look up these conditions, the actual the effect is, well, meningitis, as we know, especially for children, it can be a killer. But the terrible headaches and the blood pounding when I was actually sneezing or coughing, it's like my head wanted to explode. And I'd written quite a number of letters to my specialist saying, look, I'm still getting these symptoms, and basically, actually, although it only took the edge off sometimes, I'd been taking cocodamol for, well, 20 at least 25 years, and I was getting 200 at a time from the doctors. But anyway, so I have had some time in my life meningitis and tick-borne encephalitis. Now, what the symptoms of those, you can't have meningitis or encephalitis without knowing about it. And the only time I've experienced those particular symptoms was at the same time as when I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Now, the frustrating thing is, so basically before I had MS or was diagnosed with MS, I'd never experienced any of those symptoms. So when I had my diagnosis, it ended up becoming at the time, a clinical diagnosis, because I had the MRI scan, and it showed maybe 2 lesions, and they said that's not sufficient to say it's multiple sclerosis. I had the lumbar puncture, which actually at the time I thought that was what had caused my headaches, because you can get a headache after a lumbar puncture, but this was so severe it went on for years, and the CSF fluid was clear. So it was only over time that it was a clinical diagnosis. But I'm absolutely certain now that at the time I'd picked up, for however I don't know, meningitis and tick-borne encephalitis, and that was the start, in my opinion, of what then grew into multiple sclerosis. And if you look at the literature on meningitis and encephalitis related to multiple sclerosis, they very often are precursors. So what I basically want to say is, anybody, if you have not had these blood tests, it's like people who have been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and they've had Lyme disease. I checked for that as well, by the way, and that did actually come back negative. So I think there is something to be said for these conditions, multiple sclerosis, for instance, actually being kicked off by some sort of bacterial or viral infection. And so I would urge anybody who's actually being newly diagnosed or being diagnosed for not very long, particularly because if you have had or have meningitis or tick-borne encephalitis, then that is likely to be a precursor for multiple sclerosis. I'm not sure whether if those conditions were treated in time, it would have made any difference, but all I know is that I had that. Interestingly, now, so I've finished that subject. Interestingly, I've only had 3 scans in 3 MRI scans throughout my 31 years of MS. 2 of them were in the early years, where they were both pretty much the same, which was like a couple of lesions in my head, full stop. I thought 2 years ago, in fact no, it was probably 3 years ago, because it was after I had looked into this potential problem with what I could find out of my cause of my MS. I asked my specialist if I could have an MRI scan. So this is like what, 28 years after the previous one or something, and it was very interesting because from having 2 lesions, the report came back with, not even counting them, it just had multiple lesions in your head, multiple lesions in your spine, but interestingly, there's been no activity recently, and most interestingly was that my brain hadn't atrophied. Now, I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. I'm assuming that my brain is of normal size and it hasn't shrunk, or that it couldn't get much smaller. So I guess I should be grateful for that. The possibility that my brain hasn't atrophied is that I have spent most of my time since I've had MS either educating myself with regard to MS, or self-development, or that sort of thing. I'm very interested in British politics. I'm very interested in a number of things. So and also retraining myself, because as a financial advisor, and I'm not doing that now, although I still like to sort of mentor young entrepreneurs. I've had to retrain myself if I want to be of any use. So I've actually been educating myself, training myself on all manner of things related to computers, etc. Things that I can do when I'm able to do it. So if I'm well enough, I can get on the computer and I can actually do something. If I'm not, then I just rest and I don't feel too bad about it. The next video I'm going to talk about is the 2 very misleading words of motivation and motivation and discipline. That's going to be the next subject. Till next time, bye now.